for about 11 years, and I have worked at interactive agencies. I've worked at small startups. I started my own consultancy, and currently I am managing a fabulous team of product designers here at LogMeIn. So our theme is intention, and there's a quote by Jared Spool, who, for those of you who aren't familiar, Jared Spool is a author and UX advocate, and it's actually one of my favorite quotes. And the quote is, design is the rendering of intent. And I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about how design and intention are really synonyms. And the amount of thought and time and effort and planning that goes into a design is really interesting, because we, as designers, also have to deal with a huge amount of uncertainty. So it's all about balance. And today I'm going to talk about my personal experience in how I was balancing the situation where I was a little unintentional, and it turned out to be like not a great situation for me, and then how I used intention to sort of propel myself out of that. And I do want to say that I am not a life coach or a therapist. I told you my credentials, which are designer, so I'm just going to caveat it with that. I'm going to talk about how I use that intention to deal with the imperfection, and how I started carving out space for myself very intentionally in a few different areas. One is my sort of emotional well-being and how I was thinking about things. One is my physical space and sort of my environment around me. And then the other is sort of how I was making space for others in my life. So in 2012, my partner came to me, and he had gotten a job opportunity in Newfoundland, Canada. And a few fun facts about Newfoundland. One is that it's not Nova Scotia. Everybody thinks that Newfoundland and Nova Scotia are the same thing, and they're not. Another is that it's a half time zone. So if it's 9:30 here, then it's 11 there, which was a thing that I didn't know existed until I moved there. So pretty interesting. So he came to me with this opportunity, and I got really romantic about it, because I had always wanted to live internationally, and I was so excited about it. And I did a Google image search, and there were mountains and these beautiful fjords and like this red landscape that was really crazy. And so I was like, absolutely, let's do it. What could go wrong? So we ended up having to catalog all of our stuff, because that was something that the Canadian government required that we do. So everything that we owned was a line item on a spreadsheet. So, our record collection to like the 9 kooky buttons that I had, that I was gonna sew on a sweater, were things that the Canadian government knew about. And we put all of those things in a big truck, and we drove the truck from Boston to the tip of Nova Scotia. Then we got on a ferry for 6 hours, which went into the middle of the ocean on this island. Then we got off that and drove to 4 hours in the middle of the island. I'm telling you all this to paint the picture that it was super, super remote and very hard to get to. So when we got there, I was pretty excited, because I was actually going to take some time for myself and take a sabbatical and just explore some things that I had never gotten to explore creatively. But it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that I was going to need to actually get a job. And it was obviously really remote, so there weren't any startups or any digital agencies to get a job at. So like, what do you do? So I ended up going into hustle mode, and I started my own consultancy. And that's a really difficult thing to do when you're planning on starting your own company. People, lay the groundwork years in advance to do that. And here I was in a different country with not a lot of contacts, and I didn't know the tax laws, which makes it really tricky to run a business. So, I was lucky in that I started getting a ton of work, which is great. And it was more work than I knew how to deal with. But unfortunately, the pressure of running the company paired with that isolation was really not good for me personally. And I became really depressed, and it just wasn't great. I wasn't myself. I wasn't a good partner. I wasn't a good daughter. I wasn't a good friend. And I came to a place where I knew that I needed to start being really intentional about the space that I was carving out for myself, about the time that I was making for myself. And that was really difficult. It was really difficult for me to create these boundaries because at that time, I viewed all 24 hours of my life as billable hours. And so I really started negotiating with myself, and I started doing this thing where I would create this judgment-free bubble where I would just sit in it, and I would sit in my funk, and I would sit with those anxieties and sit with that overwhelming feeling, and I would just carve out this space where I could feel that. But then I would negotiate with myself that to have this time in my funky space bubble, that I would also have to do something really productive and be intentional about that productivity after. So what I would do is I would maybe make a list, very simple things, make a list of to-dos, or send an email that maybe I had been putting off sending because it was kind of crappy, or I would just take some time to be intentional and inventory sort of the things that were going on in my life that were creating these anxieties. And I was spending a lot of time at home, and as I was getting into this practice, I started also taking inventory of my physical space. As I said, super remote, working from home, also in Canada, so snow 6 months out of the year. So there would be stretches of 6 days where I didn't leave the house. So taking note of my physical space was something that was really important to me. And I started being really intentional about my space in a way that I hadn't before, in that I started doing really simple things like making my bed, just to shift my perspective into this is a fresh start to the day. I also incorporated that into my work style as well, in that I started this practice that regardless of how zany my day was, sketches and Post-its and nonsense and emails and whatever it was that was in my physical environment, I would straighten those up and make sure that when I opened the door to my office the next day, I was starting a fresh day rather than being mired down in the muck of the previous day. And so these were ways, really simple things that I did to be intentional about my headspace and about my physical space. And so one of the other things that I started doing was surrounding myself with plants. That's a very tiny thing, but my family owned a florist and a plant shop, not a forest. And I say those two words very similarly for some reason, so I do want to clarify. So I started surrounding myself with plants, and that was just something that made me feel really at home and really comfortable. And so I guess I would ask you to think about the time that you're spending in your spaces, whether it be your home or your office or in your car commuting back and forth to work, and ask yourself if you're being intentional in those spaces, and ask yourself how you want to feel in those spaces, and what things you want to create in those spaces if you want to create something. I'd also encourage you to think about how others are in your space. So people that you're sharing those spaces with and what those people's needs are, so whether it be a spouse or a child or a roommate, like how are you making those people feel within the space that you're sharing? Which I think is a really interesting question. So I ended up leaving Canada, shocker. But I did it in a way that I felt really good about because it was much more intentional than how I had found myself there. So I actually got an apartment here in Boston and was commuting back and forth to Boston and Canada in a way to create intentional space between those two places and figure out how I felt being in the two places. Ultimately, like, I had made a really hasty decision and it just wasn't right for me. And you know, I think that spurred me on to start taking an inventory of the things in my life that I cared about and then carving out purposeful space around them. So because I had had such an experience in Canada, I came back to Boston and I found that one of the things that was really important to me was being in the community, not necessarily the Boston community. I do break down my boxes as a neighbor. I feel like that's a good community thing to do. But really in the design community. And I've had the pleasure of having some amazing mentors in my life professionally, and they have so fundamentally impacted the way that I think about design and shaped who I am as a person that I am really grateful for that. And so when you reflect on your successes, do you reflect on your successes or do you also reflect on the people who were there with you along the way? And I know that I reflect on the people who were there with me along the way. And because of that, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is mentorship. And at Log Me In, I've had the opportunity to start a mentorship program for our UX department. And I'm hopeful that people are finding the same experiences that I'm finding and the same growth that I'm finding. But I've also had the pleasure of mentoring people myself, and that has so fundamentally shifted my perspective in a way that I didn't expect, and it's something that I'm really, really grateful for. So I would ask you to think about, in closing today, how you're creating space for others in this community, in our design community, in the larger community. And, you know, it can be something really simple, and I would encourage you to start there. It doesn't have to be this like big, arduous, I'm taking on a mentor sort of thing that feels very heavy. It can be like shaking hands and having a great conversation and actively listening in that conversation with somebody here. It can be having a cup of coffee. It can be slacking each other files and critiquing a friend's file that they're having a big problem with. And so I would just really encourage everybody in the community to start interacting in a more intentional way. And then, you know, I would encourage you to think about the things that are important to you in your life and start making space for those things and start investing in those things. And don't judge yourself if you get into a funk, if you move to a different country unintentionally. Like, it's totally cool. You can get out of that. Don't worry about it. So yeah, I appreciate you all coming out, and thanks you very much.